Thank you. Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Raegan MacDonald. I'm the head of EU Public Policy at Mozilla, based in Brussels. Thank you so much for having me here today. Mozilla is a mission-driven tech company that builds open source software. Today, I want to talk about online advertising, what's wrong, and why we need to fix it. Last week, I organized a panel on advertising at the ICD-PPC in Brussels. And one of our speakers said that if personal data is to the online advertising sector what oil is to the energy sector, then we're experiencing our version of the climate change crisis. It sounds a bit dramatic, but the more I thought about it, it's actually quite an apt metaphor and really describes, I think, how the level of crisis on how we see the online advertising status quo today. And like climate change, a lot of people seem to feel that there's something wrong with online advertising, whether it's the pervasive tracking, the market consolidation, opaque industry practices, but they seem to be so overwhelmed by the task at hand of reforming the underlying business model of the internet that they don't feel that they can really have an impact. And so since it's the underlying business model of the internet, what are we going to do? Build a whole other internet? And how can you really actually be free? But just like the real climate change crisis, there is an urgent need to understand the problems and what is going wrong. And we really need to identify the sources of clean energy. We need to identify the green technologies and the policies that we need to develop and to enforce to make meaningful progress towards an environment that fosters trust and supports innovation. And one of the key questions is really, what are the renewable sources of energy for the online advertising industry? How can we wean ourselves off of personal data as the fuel of the internet economy? Like the climate change crisis, there isn't going to be one single solution. There is no silver bullet. It's going to take actions and changes on behalf of a range of different stakeholders and a range of different sectors. And there are the deniers, those that have an interest in maintaining the status quo, to continue to mine and harvest data until regulation or social norms or something else prohibits them from continuing to do so. And so by way of caveat, I also feel that I should say that Mozilla is not against online advertising. We believe that the internet needs a profitable and relevant revenue ecosystem to create, to foster, and support innovation. And like many companies, we benefit from online advertising. A large part of Mozilla's revenue comes from royalties earned through search partnerships with the Firefox web browser. And so while this is the dominant model of the day, indeed, we always believe that we can push that model to be better. And when I say online advertising isn't sustainable, I don't mean that it's not profitable. In fact, it's an incredibly lucrative industry. In 2017, digital ad spending reached $209 billion per year. For the year. That's 41% of the overall advertising market. And for the first time, online advertising actually surpassed television advertising. And the figures are only expected to continue to rise. But for many stakeholders operating within the online ecosystem, those that depend on ad-supported websites for revenues, brands wishing to buy ads without supporting fraud or extremism or other brand unsafe content. And of course, for the everyday internet user, the current system is really at a breaking point. And as a mission-driven company, one that believes that individuals' security and privacy on the internet should be treated as fundamental and not optional, we really believe that right now the time has come for significant reform of the online ecosystem. And so I want to start a little bit by unpacking some of the reasons why we see the status quo as unsustainable. And then in the second half, I want to move into what we think, how we can make meaningful progress to try to fix it. So a lot of the challenges facing the online advertising model are actually there by design. And what I mean when I say online advertising, I mean direct marketing or programmatic advertising or behavioral advertising, just to be clear. The first design flaw is that quantity is over quality. So there is, the whole system is built on a proliferation of transactions, and which has given a rise to a proliferation of advertisements, which narrows on quantity and not quality. It's also opaque by design. There are so many actors within this vast ecosystem, buying, selling, and serving up advertisements. These transactions happen within an instant, and there are so many cooks involved. It's almost impossible to track and to know who you're actually doing business with. This is an image, now famous, the Lumascape, which shows you all of the different actors between the advertiser and the publisher and the actual user who sees the ad. You see ad agencies, media buyers, demand-side platforms, ad exchanges, ad networks, all with optimization tools, with analytics, and with data suppliers like data brokers along the way. And there's too much of a good thing. That brings me to that third point. Data, we know, can be very useful. It's certainly a key element in a lot of innovations that we're pioneering, like AI, et cetera. But targeted advertising really takes the dependence on data to a whole other level. It diverges from other forms of advertising like television, billboards, etc. And it provides you this ability to intimately, or think that you know, to know your customer, or to think that you know them, and to micro-target these groups with unprecedented precision. Studies have even shown that this level of knowledge of your customer isn't actually necessary to build brand equity. But again, if you look at the success metrics, it's about quantity and not quality. It's about serving ads and not brand equity. So the system perpetuates itself. And ultimately, this has created a system with all the wrong incentives. This is in large part because it wasn't really built with any kind of ethical framework in mind. The relationship between the user, the publisher, and the advertiser are increasingly further disintermediated. And if you look at CMOs at companies, they're tasked with showing quick turnaround, not building brand equity, and certainly not building the relationship between the publisher and the user. And we're seeing now more than ever the consequences of this approach. Online tracking has become pervasive online. And the steep rise in ad blockers is one of the clear signs that we've seen as an indicator for users of their loss of trust. And you can see here the Global Web Index from 2017 shows that 36% of internet users are using ad blockers. And users are using ad blockers for a range of reasons. Of course, there's the creepiness element of having that yoga mat that you bought follow you all around the web forever. But also, there's performance issues. So on mobile, often there's up to 36 trackers that can be on a website, which significantly delays the load time and eats up data. There are a lot of different reasons why users are adopting ad blockers, and we know that a lot of it is because of this pervasive tracking and all of those third-party cookies. And the system isn't working well for publishers either. Ad fraud is absolutely rife. Now, ad fraud is when fraudulent bots basically mimic a person by using a browser with tracking cookies. And they tried to create fake but very valuable ad impressions. This fraud is eating up an estimated $21 billion per year. That's a lot of money. The World Federation of Advertisers actually projects that this will go up to $50 billion in 2025. And we've heard from publishers that times are really difficult, those that depend on advertising as revenue. They have had a hard time looking for sustainable and varied sources of income. Another area that I work on is copyright. And publishers have almost been successful in having a copyright reform that would extend copyright to cover snippets in order to open up revenue streams for major tech aggregators like Google News. that approach as a revenue stream is still very hypothetical and hasn't yet been shown. But what if we could clean up ad fraud and get some of that $21 billion into the hands of the publishers where it really belongs? I think they would be in a very different situation. In market consolidation, earlier I showed you slides of that very crowded Lumascape with all of those different actors. There are a great many actors serving up ads and operating within this ecosystem. However, the profits are not evenly distributed. The ad tech sector is increasingly consolidating, which means that there are increasingly big profits, but only to a handful of players. And there are two players in particular that are really taking the lion's share of revenues in online advertising. That's Facebook and Google, which together are collecting 77% of ad spend, where 99% of growth can be attributable to them. In fact, 25% of the global advertising revenues are going to these two web giants. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with being successful and making profits. But in a market with so much revenue and so many different players, there should be a fair distribution. And consolidation is also problematic not only for innovation and for market entry to allow for smaller and medium players to get in the game, but it's also harder to hold a handful of players, especially serving up advertisements and things that people see on a day-to-day basis, accountable, and to get real change if you can't actually hold those players to account. And finally, the current infrastructure, which incentivizes eyeballs on content and knowing too much about your customer, has given way to a lot of the content problems that we are having today, namely disinformation or information pollution or so-called fake news. It sometimes seems like a stretch to connect disinformation and online advertising, but very simply, the more data that you can know about an individual or a group of people, the easier it is to micro-target propaganda or images or ideas to them. And so just like the system is optimized to serve us up with the perfect ad, disinformation, the system can be hijacked to serve up ideas and other thoughts that can sow discord and threaten the democratic process. And these are some of the key problems as we see them facing the online ecosystem today. And many of these would be significantly improved if we could reduce the amount of data leakage floating around in the ecosystem. It would significantly reduce the harmful impacts of misuse of data, the market consolidation, the hostile environment for users, and of course that lost money every year. And in the case of misinformation, it's even really a threat to our democracies and integrity of elections. And so that brings us on how we think that we can fix these issues. So here are a couple of ideas that I think can get us started. We need to build ethics back into this system. One of the key things that we find when we talk to publishers and advertisers and others in the ad ecosystem that really do want to do good is that the system doesn't really reward those behaving ethically. So we have to change that. We really need a paradigm shift. So those that have big brands or big market share should really be the primary movers in taking on that change and stand for more ethical approaches. We're starting to see that little by little. The World Federation of Advertisers has principles for better online advertising ecosystem, which includes a manifesto with principles on transparency and accountability. And so we need to see more initiatives like this, and we appreciate these initiatives. And it's also good for us to be aware and to continue to apply pressure on them to make sure that these types of initiatives from companies aren't just nice on paper, but they actually do try to carry them out and enforce these principles in practice. But of course, we cannot just let companies to regulate themselves. We have the GDPR, which we've talked a lot about today, which provides us really a lot of different opportunities on how we can adequately enforce this in the online ecosystem. It only came into force in May, so we think that there's still a lot to be done. For instance, what does explicit consent look like online? Are there some categories of data that are not appropriate to target users to sell ads? What are the transparency requirements for all of these different actors, like data brokers, under the GDPR? And finally, what are the limits of legitimate interest? And there's been a lot more attention paid to this advertising ecosystem in the context of the GDPR. I have there the picture of Privacy International's tweet, which last week they filed a handful of complaints to the ICO about data brokers and their potential violation of the GDPR. And there's another ongoing privacy regulation, the e-privacy regulation. So I read last week that in Politico that it was on life support in the council, and that's actually pretty accurate. So we really would like to see it pulled off of life support and actually invested in and passed, because we do think that the key things in the e-privacy regulation, the privacy of communications, the ability to allow users to meaningfully choose how they want their online experience, including opting out of tracking on any software connecting to the internet, not just browsers. We really do think that, okay, there are probably some technical things we want to work out. The banner situation doesn't work very well, but we think this could be an opportunity to provide the right incentives to allow users to actually be in greater control of their online experience. And this idea of being able to opt out of tracking or to turn it off very easily should be industry stock standard across the board. And transparency. Identifying who are the different actors, again, thinking about that Lumascape. There are some publishers, such as The Guardian, who have been supportive of a kind of transparency register for different actors in the ecosystem, which would allow them to actually enforce, to track their money, and to also be able to act and behave more ethically by knowing who their customer is. This idea seems to be something that companies are now discussing, but the UK government and others seem to also be interested in passing it into law, which could actually be very interesting and a good way to think about how to enforce ethical standards in this advertising ecosystem. And innovation is so critical. We have to be innovating for privacy and innovating for a better internet ecosystem. And here, this aspect really complements with the GDPR. So I think about the privacy by design principle, where we really want to see more companies kind of competing with each other on what kind of services and privacy and security features that they're offering. It's really easy to identify problems, or we find that it's easier to identify problems, but it's much harder to actually come up with ideas and forge solutions. So another thing that Mozilla is doing is investing in these ideas, in research, and in understanding different business models, different ways of advertising. One of those is a fellow that we have, Dave Gehring, who is working on a new project called Project Meridio. And Project Meridio would basically be like a GDPR compliant ad exchange, where users would choose to share information with websites that they trust, and that information will not leak anywhere else. And these are the kinds of initiatives that we want to support, and we want to think about how can we do this better, and how can we do it with privacy and with the user in mind. And last but not least, tools and features and technical measures. So for Mozilla, starting this month and moving into early 2019, we will be rolling out a number of new features that will, by default, protect users by blocking tracking and also offering them easy to use, more choice over what information they share with different websites. And this includes blocking cross-site tracking by default and blocking a number of harmful practices such as crypto mining and fingerprinting. And we're also really excited about a new collaboration with the Tor project. So we want to bring cutting-edge security and privacy to to Firefox by leveraging the technologies of the Tor browser and the Tor proxy. This project is still really experimental and in its early phases, but we're really excited to think about what this collaboration could mean and what kind of super privacy experience we can offer in the Firefox browser. And to conclude, we have a ton of work to do. But at Mozilla, we're very optimistic people, and we do believe that we can rally to address our industry's climate change crisis, because we just can no longer ignore the facts. We want to find those sources of renewable energy and break the industry's dependence on personal data as the fuel of our economy. We want to think about different and new ways to advertise, to devalue non-consent-based data, and to create a fair value exchange where users are empowered and have choice. These improvements, if even incremental and seemingly small, will help clean up our ecosystem so we can create an environment where we actually want to live in, one that is not hostile, and one where we feel safe, empowered, and in control. Thank you.